The man who survived Netherlands' launch pad did so because he stepped away to smoke a cigarette. Mikhail Yangel, chief designer of the R-16, walked behind a concrete bunker roughly 200 meters from the pad. He lit a cigarette. 30 seconds later, the second stage engine ignited. When he came back, there was no pad. There were no people. The asphalt between the bunker and the launch structure had melted. Survivors who tried to run found the ground burning under their feet. The Soviet government announced that Marshal Nederland had died in a plane crash during a special assignment. 29 years passed before a single Soviet publication acknowledged what actually happened on October 24, 1960. But here's the thing. The R-16 disaster was not the beginning of the story. It wasn't even the worst-kept secret in liquid-fueled missile programs. It was simply the most lethal single event. The logic that produced it, press forward, don't delay, keep personnel on site during fueling under deadline pressure, was the same logic operating on the other side of the world, at a completely different scale, in the fields and suburbs of New Jersey. May 22, 1958, Battery B, Chapel Hill section of Middletown. A team of soldiers and civilian contractors is installing new arming mechanisms on Nike Ajax missiles in underground storage. One missile detonates. 7 more follow in chain. 10 men dead, 6 soldiers, 4 civilians. Warhead fragments scattered across several hundred meters of New Jersey countryside. A general described it, officially, as an accident that could not happen, but did. It had already happened 3 years earlier, quietly. April 14, 1955. Fort Meade, Maryland. A Nike Ajax booster ignited during a drill. Not a combat alert, a routine training procedure. The cause: rainwater had entered a junction box and caused an electrical short that bypassed every pre-launch safety check the crew had performed correctly. The missile left its launcher at the wrong angle, broke apart in flight, and scattered booster fragments onto a highway. Nobody died. The Army classified the investigation, adjusted the procedure, and kept the system on alert. This was the pattern. Not catastrophic failure followed by withdrawal, but catastrophic failure followed by documentation, adjustment, and continuation. Because the alternative was admitting that the fuel driving the first generation of operational missile defense was fundamentally incompatible with the conditions of peacetime service. RFNA and UDMH don't become safer through familiarity. They become routine. And routine is exactly when people stop wearing the full chemical protection kit because it's July and the gloves are already torn and the procedure will only take a minute. The Soviet fuel mixture had a nickname inside the program: Devil's Venom. The Americans didn't have a nickname. They had a smell: sharp, rust-colored, chemically sweet in a way that meant something was wrong before you could identify what. Both sides had the same smell over their launch positions. Both sides normalized it. Both sides paid for that normalization on a maintenance schedule that repeated itself, with variations, across every liquid-fueled system the Cold War produced. Thor and Jupiter would take that logic and deploy it not in New Jersey or Kazakhstan, but in English farm fields and Italian olive groves, under open sky, with no underground storage and no blast protection. Just the missile, the crew, and the same chemistry. The men stationed at RAF Feltwell in Norfolk knew exactly one operational fact that defined their entire service. The flight time of a Soviet ballistic missile from a launch site near Kaliningrad to their position in eastern England was approximately 8 minutes. Their own pre-launch fueling procedure, from the moment a missile-ready order arrived to the moment Thor was physically capable of firing, took 15. This was not classified information. Everyone on the crew knew it. Nobody in the official briefings ever addressed the arithmetic directly. They didn't need to. The numbers did that themselves, quietly, every shift. PGM-17. Thor ran on liquid oxygen and RP-1, a refined kerosene. Liquid oxygen exists at minus 183 degrees Celsius. You cannot store it inside the missile for more than a few hours without it boiling off through the relief valves. You cannot pre-fuel and wait. Every time the crew went to readiness, They went through the same fueling sequence from scratch. Cryogenic tanker alongside, LOX loading under pressure, RP1 as a separate operation, pressure checks, electrical checks, guidance alignment, 15 minutes minimum under ideal conditions, in a Yorkshire winter, with ice on the connector lines and hydraulic systems cold-soaked overnight, longer. The missile itself sat horizontal on a launch rail in the open air. No silo, no blast door, no protection from anything, weather, conventional strike, or the kind of catastrophic LOX fire that had already occurred during training exercises when pump seals failed and oxygen-soaked components contacted fuel residue. The resulting fires burned at temperatures that made standard extinguishing equipment operationally useless. The crew's procedure in that scenario was to evacuate the immediate area and wait. Jupiter in Italy and Turkey had the same fuel pair and the same exposure. 30 missiles in Apulia, 15 in Turkey, each one standing on a concrete pad surrounded by agricultural land, visible from the road, photographed in detail by Soviet intelligence within months of deployment. The two key launch protocol required both an American officer and a host nation officer to complete the sequence. The American and Italian officers at the Gioia del Colle site communicated in a mixture of technical English and improvised hand signals during drills, because the language training allocation for the program had been, one report noted, insufficient for operational precision. The Turkish Jupiter batteries were removed in April 1963, 4 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The crews learned this from news radio before any official notification reached the base. What the news didn't report, and what remained inside diplomatic cables for decades, was that Kennedy had agreed to their removal as part of the private resolution of the crisis. The Jupiters in Turkey were traded for Soviet missiles in Cuba. The crews who had spent 2 years managing cryogenic fuel in Turkish winter conditions, within range of Soviet medium-range missiles, were not consulted. They were informed after the fact by a transistor radio in a guard shack. Thor was gone by August 1963, Jupiter by the same year. Both programs lasted roughly 4 years in operational deployment. Both were superseded by Polaris submarine-launched missiles, which could strike the same targets from underwater, without a 15-minute countdown, without open-air positions, and without requiring the launch crew to already be dead before the missile could theoretically fire. The engineers who designed Polaris had read the Thor and Jupiter operational reports. The lesson wasn't subtle. At McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, the Beaumark missiles lived in individual concrete shelters called coffins. The name was unofficial. It stuck because it was accurate, low, rectangular, just large enough for one missile, with a sliding roof that opened on launch command to expose the weapon to the sky. 56 of them in a row, each one permanently fueled, permanently armed, maintained at 2-minute readiness around the clock. On June 7, 1960, a helium pressure vessel in Coffin 204 ruptured during a routine maintenance cycle. The hypergolic propellant system breached. IRFNA and UDMH contacted each other the way hypergolic propellants always do, immediately, without requiring a spark. The missile burned where it stood. The W-40 nuclear warhead fell through the floor of the burning shelter onto the concrete pad below. There was no nuclear detonation. The warhead's conventional explosive components partially burned rather than detonated, which was the difference between a contamination incident and something with no precedent in peacetime American history. The fire crews arrived in standard protective gear. Nobody told them initially what the warhead contained. The surrounding townships received no official notification about the nature of the contamination for weeks. The 75 acres surrounding that shelter remain a fenced exclusion zone today, more than 6 decades later, classified under the EPA designation Beaumark Site RW-01. You can find it on a map. You cannot walk on it. The Beaumark crews knew what was in those coffins. They worked alongside them on rotating shifts, 12 hours at a time, in a facility where the standing procedure for a propellant leak was to evacuate the immediate area, which, given the coffin layout, meant evacuating the position they had just been standing at. The psychological adjustment required to treat this as normal working conditions has no formal name in any Army document. The crews simply did it, because the alternative was refusing to serve, which was not an option anyone articulated. Honest John presented the opposite problem. No complexity, no cryogenics, no hypergolic chemistry to fear. It was a tube on a trailer that fired an unguided rocket. The propellant was solid. The procedure was simple. The accuracy was roughly 300 meters circular error probable at maximum range, an official figure that the crews themselves generally considered optimistic for field conditions with real wind and real terrain. The warhead was the W-31, with a yield selectable between 2 and 40 kilotons. At the low end, 300 meters of error was still well inside the lethal radius. At the high end, the question of where exactly the weapon landed became mathematically academic. The crews called the system fire and pray, not because they were being flippant, but because that was a precise operational description of what happened after launch. The rocket left the rail. Gravity and spin stabilization took over. The crew's influence on the outcome ended at ignition. Honest John entered service in 1953. It left American service in 1982. 29 years. During that entire period, no guidance system was added, no terminal correction capability was developed, no fundamental accuracy improvement was fielded. The system was replaced not because it was upgraded, but because Lance arrived, and Lance, as the crews who served on it would shortly discover, had solved the problem of unguided flight by replacing it with a different problem entirely. The R-12 Divina had one advantage over every American liquid-fueled system deployed in the same era. Its oxidizer didn't need to be kept at cryogenic temperature. A K-27I, a mixture of nitric acid and nitrogen tetroxide, was storable. You could load it into the missile and leave it there. No boil-off, no 15-minute fueling window, no cryogenic tanker on standby. What you got instead was a slow chemical war between the oxidizer and every seal, gasket, and connector in the fuel system. Nitric acid at concentration doesn't wait for a catastrophic event to do damage. It works steadily, invisibly, corroding elastomer seals from the inside over months of service. The procedure for detecting a compromised seal was, in practice, to notice the smell or the discoloration on the external plumbing, which meant the leak was already happening. The R-12 crews on Cuba in October 1962 were managing this chemistry in conditions nobody had planned for. Tropical humidity, temperatures above 30 degrees, no prepared infrastructure, and a deployment schedule that had been compressed so aggressively that several batteries were still being assembled when American U-2 photographs of their positions reached the White House. The men working on those missiles wore standard field uniforms. There was no chemical protection equipment issued as standard at forward positions. The safety protocols written for temperate climate Soviet bases assumed covered facilities, trained support personnel, and time. Cuba offered none of those things. They remained on those positions for weeks. Under reconnaissance overflights, they could hear but not intercept, servicing missiles pointed at cities they could not see. Under orders, they had no authority to question and no channel to dispute. The Pershing II disaster came 23 years later, and on the other side of the equation, not corrosion, but kinetic energy. January 11, 1985, Waldheide near Heilbronn, West Germany. A Pershing II missile was being extracted from its transport canister by crane during a maintenance operation. The missile shifted during the lift. The first-stage solid fuel motor contacted the canister lip, generating sufficient friction to initiate combustion. A solid fuel rocket motor does not stop burning once started. There is no abort, no cutoff, no procedure for interruption. The motor burns until the propellant is exhausted, at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius. Sergeant Todd Zephyr, Staff Sergeant John Rich, and Private Darren Shirley died in the first seconds. 16 others were injured. The maintenance tent and 2 support vehicles were destroyed. The warhead, a W-85, was not installed at the time. That detail was in every official statement. It was accurate. It was also beside the point, because the same crane, the same canister, the same procedure existed on days when the warhead was installed. The accident established that the procedure itself was the failure, not the payload configuration on that specific morning. Pershing II had been on West German soil for 13 months when this happened. The anti-nuclear protest movement surrounding the bases had been continuous since deployment began in December 1983. Heilbronn didn't create the opposition, but it gave it something that rhetoric couldn't supply: a factual answer to the question of whether the missile was dangerous to the people living near it. The answer: 3 dead soldiers and 16 wounded in a maintenance yard 50 kilometers from Stuttgart, was not ambiguous. Lance solved the problem of Honest John's complete lack of guidance by installing an actual propulsion and steering system. It solved the problem of uncontrolled flight by giving the crew a missile that went where it was aimed. What it did not solve, what nobody in the program appeared to treat as a primary design constraint, was what happened to the people maintaining it between launches. The fuel combination was UDMH and IRFNA, the same pairing that had burned through Nike Ajax gloves, that had left yellow stains on concrete at battery positions across the continental United States throughout the late 1950s. Lance was smaller, more mobile, mounted on a tracked M752 carrier that could keep pace with armored formations. The propellant system was more compact. More compact meant the fuel lines, connectors, and seals were closer together, the working space around them tighter, and any leak more immediately present to the personnel performing maintenance. Field reports from Lance batteries in West Germany described chronic low-level seepage as a routine condition rather than an incident requiring report. The Army's own training materials for Lance maintenance included a dedicated section on recognizing symptoms of subchronic UDMH exposure: irritability, disrupted sleep, difficulty concentrating. The section existed because the symptoms were common enough to require official guidance. The personnel who read that section and then went back to work on the fuel system did so because the system was on alert, and alert status did not pause for occupational health concerns. The W-70-3 warhead, the neutron bomb variant, spent more time in political controversy than in deployment. Cancelled in 1978 after protests in Europe and a public dispute between Carter and NATO allies. Reinstated in 1981. Some Lance crews served through both decisions without being informed of the warhead configuration on their specific missiles until a change of status required documentation. Frog 7 operated from the opposite end of the technical spectrum and arrived at a similar psychological destination by a different route. No hypergolic fuel, no guidance electronics, no warhead configuration ambiguity, just a large solid fuel rocket on a wheeled transporter, pointed in the approximate direction of the target, launched by command. The Frog 7's CEP at maximum range was officially listed at 500 to 700 meters. Crews who worked with the system in Warsaw Pact exercises understood this figure as a best-case estimate derived from controlled conditions: real dispersion in field conditions, variable wind, approximate surveying of the firing point, launcher leveling on uneven terrain, pushed that number further. Against a target requiring a conventional warhead, this was operationally acceptable. Against a target requiring a nuclear or chemical warhead, the question of exactly where the weapon landed became a matter of doctrine rather than ballistics. The yield or the agent concentration covered the error. The crews were not consulted on which warhead was loaded. That decision existed at a command level above the battery. The men who set the launch angle, verified the charge, and initiated the firing sequence did not always know, in the full technical sense, what they had just sent downrange. This was by design. It was also, for the people standing at that launcher after ignition, the most precise summary of their relationship to the weapons they served: full operational responsibility, partial informational access, and a rocket already gone before the wind data finished updating. Everything described in this video, the corroded seals, the burning pads, the arithmetic of launch times shorter than fueling procedures, happened on land, with solid ground under the crew's feet, and the option, however theoretical, of running. The sailors who served on USS Tunney and USS Barbaro did not have that option. They had the ocean. Regulus I was a subsonic cruise missile, 10 meters long, stored in a pressurized hangar built into the bow of a converted submarine. The hangar displaced enough internal volume that crew berthing was reorganized around it. The smell of jet fuel, JP4, the same grade used in naval aviation, was a permanent background condition in the forward compartments. Not a leak, not a malfunction, just the ambient presence of a fueled missile in an enclosed steel hull. The launch procedure required the submarine to surface completely. Hatch open, missile extracted to the deck, wings unfolded, engine started, guidance system aligned to a surface fix. The full sequence from surfacing to launch readiness took approximately 10 minutes. A surface submarine in Soviet-patrolled waters of the Pacific was detectable by radar, by maritime patrol aircraft, and by any submarine running at periscope depth within sonar range. The crew understood this. The operational concept acknowledged it. The acknowledged solution was to accept the exposure as a necessary cost of the mission. Regulus also required 2 additional vessels, ships or submarines, to maintain radio command guidance throughout the missile's flight. If contact broke, the missile flew on its last commanded heading until fuel exhaustion. The system assumed the communication chain would remain intact through the same operational environment that had just required the launch submarine to surface and expose itself. USS Tunney held Regulus alert patrols from 1959 until the system was retired in 1964. The crews rotated through 9-month deployments. When Polaris A-1 achieved operational status aboard USS George Washington in 1960, the comparison was immediate and total. Submarine-launched ballistic missile, solid fuel, underwater launch, no external guidance required, crew never surfaces. The operational logic of Regulus, surface, expose, launch, hope, collapsed in the same year it was first seriously threatened by the system it should have been from the start. What connects Regulus to Nike Ajax, Thor to Frog 7, Beaumark to Pershing, is not incompetence. The engineers who designed these systems solved real problems under genuine constraints. The fuels that burned crews were also the fuels that produced the specific energy densities the missions required. The accuracy limits that made nuclear warheads necessary were limits of available guidance technology, not indifference to consequences. The thread that connects them is something simpler and harder to fix: the consistent institutional decision to document the human cost, adjust the procedure at the margin, and continue. Every accident report in this video was written. Every chemical exposure pattern was eventually recognized. The knowledge existed. The system stayed in service because the alternative, admitting the gap between what had been fielded and what was safe to operate, had a political cost that no individual accident yet exceeded. Nike Ajax came off alert in 1963. The last Lance left service in 1992. Somewhere in that 29-year span, across 10 systems and 2 superpowers, the Cold War extracted a toll from its own operators that no adversary ever came close to matching. The missiles never fired in anger. The chemistry did.